Alright, so imagine this. You wake up in ancient Athens. Sun's just peeking over the marble skyline, birds are chirping, and oh wait, there's no coffee. Nope, not a drop of that sweet life-giving nectar anywhere. You're about to face a day with no caffeine, no instant gratification, and, spoiler alert, a diet that would make your modern vegan hipster friends spit out their kombucha. Welcome to the world of ancient Greek food and diet, where delicious was a concept as foreign as a smartphone with Wi-Fi. First off, the staple of the ancient Greek diet was Puls. If you don't know what that is, congratulations, you just dodged the first culinary bullet of the day. Puls was basically a porridge made from boiled grains, usually barley or wheat. Think of it as the ancient Greek version of oatmeal, except imagine eating it every single meal, every single day, and never once adding a dash of cinnamon or a handful of raisins to make it bearable. No sugar, no chocolate, no maple syrup, nada. Your taste buds will be in full, "why am I even here?" mode by lunchtime, and that's just the start. Vegetables were mostly seasonal and simple. Lentils, onions, garlic, and leeks. Oh, and olives. Lots of olives. Not the fancy marinated ones you find in gourmet stores today either. These were salty, bitter, and probably a bit on the shriveled side. You could expect plenty of olive oil, though, which was definitely a positive. Because if you're going to eat this much Puls, you need something to slide down the dry throat. But the oil was more like a necessity than a flavor enhancer. It was the grease that kept the wheels of the ancient Greek body turning. Now, you might think, well, at least they had meat, right? Ha! Meat was a luxury item, reserved for festivals, sacrifices, or the very rich. The average Athenian might see a piece of meat once or twice a month, if they were lucky. Usually, they'd get their protein from fish if they lived near the coast, or from legumes and cheese. Yes, cheese was actually a go-to snack, but not the creamy brie or the sharp cheddar we adore today. It was more like a crumbly, salty block of, is this even edible? The thought of snacking on that might make you reach for a granola bar in modern horror. Speaking of snacks, forget candy bars or chips. The ancient Greeks had no sugar. None. Unless you count honey, which was used sparingly because it was precious and expensive. So your sweet cravings? Tough luck. You'd be chewing on dried figs and grapes and calling that dessert. By modern standards, this diet would be a nightmare. Your taste buds would be staging a rebellion within the first hour. But hey, at least you're getting fiber, right? Yep, tons of it. The ancient diet was bulky and hearty, which is great for digestion but terrible for your modern lazy gut, accustomed to processed, soft foods. You'd be clutching your stomach, wondering why your intestines suddenly feel like they're doing CrossFit. And what about drinks? You might be hoping for a soda or a nice cold beer to wash down your Puls. Nope again. Water was sometimes sketchy, so the Greeks drank diluted wine, mostly because it was safer than water, and it helped make their gritty meals a bit more palatable. So imagine starting your day with wine for breakfast. You might think that's a bonus until you realize it's basically watered-down grape juice that's mostly there to keep you from dying of dysentery. Alright? So you've survived the breakfast of champions. Or more accurately, the breakfast of, how is this still edible? Now comes lunch and dinner, which are pretty much the same deal. More Puls, more olives, some fish or cheese if you're lucky, and a lot of bread. Oh, and forget about spices. The ancient Greeks used herbs, but forget about the rich, complex spice blends you've got in your kitchen. Cumin, cinnamon, and pepper. They were either unknown or unaffordable. Your food would taste like someone took a bowl of grains and said, "Here, eat." So now you're thinking, okay, I can survive on this Spartan menu as long as I don't have to, do anything after eating. But guess what? The ancient Greeks were surprisingly active people. They walked everywhere, engaged in physical labor, and, if you were a citizen, participated in politics, philosophy, and military drills. So your belly would be demanding fuel and energy, but your food is more like glue. You'd feel sluggish, frustrated, and constantly craving that one thing you can't have. A damn Snickers bar. And here's a brutal truth. The lack of variety and taste wasn't just a sad coincidence. It was a cultural thing. The Greeks valued moderation and simplicity in food. They thought fancy dishes were for barbarians or the decadent. So if you showed up with your avocado toast or quinoa salad, They'd probably raise an eyebrow and quietly question your manhood or your respect for the gods. Oh, and speaking of gods, don't forget that many meals were also tied to religious rituals. Sometimes you had to sacrifice part of your food to the gods before eating. Imagine trying to Instagram your lunch only to have to offer a portion of it to Zeus first. Not exactly influencer-friendly. Now, to make matters worse, the concept of snacking as you know it didn't really exist. You ate 3 meals a day and that was it. No grazing, no munching. This meant that if you were hungry between meals, you either sucked it up or risked social disapproval for being greedy. Picture yourself at a symposium, trying to politely ignore the rumbling in your stomach while someone discusses the nature of justice for 3 hours straight. It's a recipe for hangry disaster. And okay, let's not forget about the texture of all this food. Puls was mushy, bread was often hard as a rock or stale, and the fish, well, if you weren't by the sea, you were eating something that probably had been salted and dried to the point of resembling a leather shoe. So every bite was a test of endurance. You might be wondering if there was ever a moment of joy or flavor explosion in this culinary wasteland. Actually, yes. Festivals were a big deal, and during those times, people could gorge themselves on meat, wine, and sweets. But those were rare, like a holiday from misery. The rest of the year, back to the same old routine. So, to sum up, if you, modern reader, were dropped into an ancient Greek kitchen, here's how your day would go. You wake up, no coffee, and eat a bowl of bland, gritty porridge. You drink watered-down wine, chew on a salty chunk of cheese for lunch, and maybe swallow a few olives. No snacks, no sugar, and no flavor bombs. Oh, and by the way, you're expected to be physically active and socially engaged all day while your gut screams for something better. Honestly, you wouldn't last a day without calling a time machine Uber back to your cozy, air-conditioned apartment with a fridge full of snacks and a Starbucks on every corner. And that's just the food. Wait until we get to hygiene and sanitation. Spoiler alert. You might wish you could eat that Puls again just for comfort. But hey, at least you wouldn't have to deal with the agony of sitting through a 5-hour-long play without Netflix, right? Oh no, that's coming up. And it's going to make your pulse-fueled stomach ache seem like a vacation. So, ready for the next ancient Greek adventure? Just remember, whatever you do, don't ask for ketchup. Alright, so picture this. You've just survived the culinary equivalent of a desert trek. Your stomach rumbling, mouth dry, and taste buds screaming for mercy after a day of Puls and stale bread. You think, okay, maybe I can at least find solace in a bit of hygiene? Ha! You poor, deluded modern soul. Because when it comes to ancient Greek hygiene, brace yourself. It's about to get a little intimate. You see, soap as we know it? Nope, doesn't exist. Not in any convenient pump bottle or fragrant bar that leaves you smelling like a Mediterranean garden. Instead, the Greeks had this thing called strigil. Picture a curved metal scraper that looks like a sinister banana peel. After a sweaty day, the typical Greek would slather themselves in olive oil. Yes, olive oil. And then scrape it off, along with all the dirt, sweat, and whatever else is clinging to your skin, using this sharp metal contraption. Imagine trying that without cutting yourself, and in a public bath, with your neighbors all watching. Oh yes, the baths were communal. No privacy screens, no individual towels. You share everything, including the awkward eye contact while you're rubbing off layers of grime and bodily oils. So, you walk into one of these public baths, expecting a nice, warm soak. Instead, you find a place that's part spa, part social club, part germ festival. The water, variable. Sometimes it's fresh, sometimes it's lukewarm, and sometimes it's questionable. And definitely no chlorine or fancy filtration systems. If you think your local swimming pool gets a little funky, well, ancient Greek baths were probably hosting parties for all kinds of microscopic freeloaders. Now, hold on. Before you start imagining this as some sort of relaxing, Instagram-worthy experience, remember? The baths were also the hub of gossip, political scheming, and philosophical debates. So if you thought getting your skin scraped raw was uncomfortable, try doing it while someone's loudly debating whether Socrates was a menace or a national treasure, and another person is loudly insisting that the best way to win an argument is to shout louder. And yes, everyone is stark naked. No towels, no bathrobes. You're bearing it all, literally and metaphorically, in front of your entire polis. The ultimate test of confidence, or just a nightmare for the modest. But wait, there's more. Sanitation facilities were, let's call them basic. Public toilets were a thing. But imagine a long bench with holes cut into it, side by side, no partitions. That's right. Ancient Greeks really nailed the concept of togetherness in the worst possible way. You sit, or squat, depending on your agility and pain threshold, next to your fellow citizens, chatting about the news of the day, the latest play, or who's been sleeping with whom, while doing your business. The idea of privacy was, well, it was a very different concept back then. It's like a brunch but for poop. And forget your phone to distract you. The only entertainment is the awkward silence broken by a cough or some very unfortunate sounds. And here's the kicker. There was no running water or flushing. Instead, people used a sponge on a stick, which was rinsed in a bucket of water, and then passed along to the next person. If you just shuddered, congratulations. You've just experienced the ancient Greek equivalent of modern horror films. This communal sponge was called a tersorium, and it was the original pass-it-on game, but with germs. You can just imagine the economies of scale when it comes to intestinal parasites. Now, if you somehow survive this intimate group bonding experience, you might think about washing your hands. Spoiler alert, there's no soap. The Greeks sometimes used ashes or sand to scrub, but more often than not, they just rinsed with water, if it was available. So good luck trying to avoid the plague-ridden handshake or the handshake of someone who didn't exactly clean their hands after the tersorium experience. And all this is just the daily routine. Don't get me started on dealing with lice, fleas, or the occasional untouchable itch that no amount of olive oil scrapping could fix. You'd be itching so much you'd look like you'd just discovered a new dance move. Call it the Ancient Greek Scratch Shuffle. Now shifting gears entirely, but not by much. Since we're all still talking about the unglamorous realities of ancient Greek life, let's talk about the fashion disaster that was hoplite armor. Because if you thought dealing with communal baths and sponge sticks was tough, try lugging around a 60-pound suit of bronze for hours on end. Yes, the hoplite soldier was basically a walking, sweaty, grunting fortress of metal. You had your bronze helmet, chest cuirass, greaves, and the famous hoplon shield, which was as heavy as your average modern snowblower. Imagine trying to commute to work with all that strapped onto you. No Uber for hoplites, just plain old stamina and sore muscles. And once you get into formation, the phalanx, that tight, almost indestructible wall of shields and spears, you'd better be ready to stand shoulder to shoulder with your neighbor, who is probably sweating as much as you are. The fight wasn't just about strength, but endurance and discipline. You'd be on your feet, moving as a unit, trying not to faint or throw up from overheating or exhaustion. And there was no take 5 or water break every 20 minutes. Hydration stations were a luxury, and the groans of soldiers weighed down by their gear were a constant soundtrack. Imagine if your morning jog involved a full suit of armor. You'd probably hit the local coffee shop, order a triple espresso, then collapse on the sidewalk. Oh, and the helmets? Designed to intimidate the enemy? Sure, but also to restrict your vision and hearing. So, you're sweating under a heavy bronze lid, barely able to see the guy 4 feet in front of you, trying to follow orders shouted from a distance, while the world sounds muffled and echoey. It's no wonder the term fog of war was born. And as a hoplite, you weren't just a soldier, you were a citizen soldier. That meant your civic duty included turning up for battle or defense whenever required. So, spontaneous weekend plans? Forget about it. When the call came, you suited up like a knight from a medieval fantasy, only way less comfortable and way more grueling. Now if you're thinking, well, at least these guys got a break when they weren't fighting or bathing, let me stop you right there. Because politics in ancient Greece was like an endless reality TV show, with more shouting, less commercial breaks, and 0 elimination episodes. Take Athenian democracy, for example. You'd think being part of a direct democracy sounds pretty cool, right? Voting on laws, debating policies, having your say? Yes and no. The catch is that democracy meant you had to be physically present in the assembly for hours on end, sometimes from dawn till dusk. Imagine your Monday morning stand-up meeting stretching so long you forget what sunlight feels like. And it wasn't just the time commitment. The process was brutally exhausting. filtering through endless speeches, arguments, counterarguments, and rhetorical flourishes. If you get tired now watching a 2-hour political debate on TV, think about standing in the sun for 6 hours, listening to people argue about olive tariffs or grain imports. Plus, the threat of ostracism hung over everyone's heads. That's right, ostracism. The ancient Greek version of, "You're outta here." If you rubbed enough people the wrong way, you'd be exiled for 10 years. No social media to defend yourself, no lawyers, just a public vote to send you packing. So every debate wasn't just about policy, it was about survival. You'd have to be as charming as a stand-up comedian and as ruthless as a reality TV villain if you wanted to stick around. And what did all this mean for your daily schedule? Well, you'd have to juggle farming, artillery practice, attending massive public debates, and maybe even philosophizing a bit on the side. Spoiler: philosophers were the original talk show hosts, except instead of a couch and coffee mugs, they had dusty robes and a penchant for confusing everyone, and they never shut up. Speaking of philosophy, did you know the average ancient Greek play could last for like 5 hours? That's right, 5 hours! You think binge-watching a Netflix series is a commitment? Try sitting in an open-air theater, sweating through your bronze armor or linen tunic if you're lucky, listening to stories about gods, heroes, and tragic family drama that drags on like your least favorite soap opera. And no popcorn or comfy seats, just hard stone benches and the occasional fly buzzing in your ear. And if you thought you could sneak out halfway through, forget it. The entire polis was there, and social pressure was real. Plus, the plays were political, philosophical, and frankly, exhausting. So your brain was fried, your legs were sore, and your stomach remembered the pulls it missed during the day. So, to recap, you'd be scraping sweat and dirt off yourself with a metal banana, sitting cheek to cheek with strangers while doing your business, lugging around a ton of bronze like it was a fashion statement, dedicating your life to endless political meetings or philosophical debates, and then spending your evenings trapped in marathon plays with no escape and no snacks. And if by some miracle you survive all that, congratulations, you're officially an ancient Greek. But spoiler, you probably won't. Because your modern self, accustomed to heated bathrooms, personal hygiene products, padded seats, and quick coffee breaks, just doesn't have the stamina or guts for it. So next time you complain about your commute, your office politics, or a 5-hour Zoom call, just remember, at least you're not scrapping olive oil off your back with a sharp metal banana, or sharing a sponge stick with your neighbors. Now, about those public toilets. But hey, that's a story for another day. Maybe one where you've already taken a shower, preferably with soap. Alright, so you think your lunch breaks are tough? Try surviving a day in ancient Greece, and keep that in mind while you're munching your avocado toast. Because the food situation? Oh boy, the food situation. If you're imagining olives, feta cheese, and endless grapevines, sure, you've got the tourist brochure version down. But living it? Different ballgame, my friend. Welcome to the land of Puls. Yes, that's not a typo. It's the cornerstone of their entire diet. Puls, if you didn't know, is basically a mushy porridge made from barley or wheat boiled in water, or sometimes in broth if you're feeling fancy. Think of it like the ancient Greek version of plain oatmeal, except it's more like eating a soggy, flavorless cardboard that's been sitting in a pot all day. Now, imagine you're this modern human, used to grabbing a caramel macchiato and a muffin on the way to work, and suddenly you're handed a big bowl of hot, bland mush as your main course. But wait, there's no sugar! Sugar as we know it? Unheard of! The Greeks didn't have refined sugar. Honey was the only sweetener, and it was as precious as gold. So unless you happened to be honey-rich, every meal was a savory, or, more accurately, not sweet and probably a little sad, affair. And speaking of sad, their vegetables? Mostly whatever grew wild and wasn't poisonous. Wild greens, some onions, garlic, leeks, and if you were lucky, a few beans. Meat was rare, reserved for festivals or the very wealthy. So you, modern person, who's used to a diet full of variety, flavor explosions, and snacks every hour, would quickly find yourself craving, oh, I don't know, anything that isn't mush. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so I eat some mush and get a little hungry. That's not so bad. But then comes the olive oil. The Greeks loved their olive oil. No surprise there. It was like liquid gold and used for everything. Cooking, dressing, even as a moisturizer. But here's the kicker. When they ate Puls, they often dunked their bread into oil, or poured it on the mush to add flavor. Great idea, right? Except the oil was almost like a salad dressing on top of mush that's already kind of mushy. So the texture combination is less delicious and more a slippery, oily lump sliding down your throat with the grace of a confused otter. And get this. Sometimes they'd add vinegar, herbs, or even fish sauce. Garum, if you want to sound fancy, to jazz things up. Fish sauce, like a briny, salty condiment made from fermented fish guts. Imagine spooning that on your mush for breakfast and trying not to gag. Your taste buds would be holding an intervention by lunchtime. But that's just the start of the culinary misery buffet. Let's talk about snack time, or rather the lack thereof. No vending machines, no corner convenience stores, no mini fridges chock full of energy bars. If you wanted to eat, you had to actually prepare something, which involved grinding grains, fetching water, tending to fires, and hoping the neighbors didn't steal your last loaf of bread. Wait, did I say hoping? I mean, if they did, you might have to throw down. And in ancient Greece, throwing down could mean a fistfight or worse. The local authorities might get involved. Which leads us to politics, but hold that thought. That's for later. Back to the kitchen. Cooking was a labor-intensive process. No microwaves or slow cookers. You had to build and tend to a fire, manage your pots, and pray your food didn't burn or turn into a charcoal sacrifice to the gods. And since fuel was precious, you couldn't just roast a whole pig whenever you felt like it. Plus cooking indoors? Not really a thing. The kitchens were often outside or semi-outside spaces, which means you were battling weather, bugs, and whatever neighborhood cats were eyeing your food with serious intent. And the water. Oh, the water. Not just for cooking, but for washing. Food, dishes, hands, and eventually yourself. Drinking water was sometimes suspect, so people often diluted their wine with water to avoid getting sick. Yes, wine was safer than water. Imagine that at your next dinner party. Now, speaking of hygiene and sanitation, this is where things get both fascinating and horrifying. Remember the public toilets I teased before? Picture this, communal latrines, basically benches with holes cut in them, lined up cheek to cheek, literally. No stalls, no privacy. It was a social event. You'd drop your business while chatting with your neighbor about the latest political scandal, or whose armor looked shiniest. And instead of toilet paper, they used a communal sponge on a stick, rinsed in a bucket of water. No joke. The tersorium, the epitome of communal sharing. For a modern germaphobe, that's a nightmare wrapped in a nightmare. Hygiene products? Soap was non-existent. People washed with olive oil and scraped it off with a strigil, a curved metal tool that doubled as a kind of prehistoric back-scratcher/exfoliator. Imagine trying to explain to your dermatologist that your skincare routine involves mass amounts of oil and scraping with a metal banana. And this was how athletes and soldiers cleaned themselves after training or battle. Charming, right? But hey, the Greeks did love their baths, even if the concept was different. Bathing was often communal, in public or shared facilities. No bubbles, no rubber duckies, just people sitting or standing in crowded pools or tubs, gossiping and sometimes philosophizing about life and death. You know, casual morning bath chat. But no soap, so you were basically washing away sweat and dirt with water and olive oil, then scraping away the oily layer. So, your skin might feel as slick as a freshly oiled statue, minus the artistry. And this leads us straight into the military life, which is its own circus of discomfort. You might have heard of the hoplite, the quintessential Greek soldier decked out in bronze armor, carrying a huge round shield, sword, and spear. But if you think it was just about looking cool, think again. The armor alone weighed upwards of 35 pounds, and that's before you added your shield, which was basically a door-sized piece of wood and bronze. Now imagine you waking up, putting on your entire heavy metal ensemble in the morning heat, marching into battle without the comfort of sneakers or hydration packs, and holding a shield that could double as a coffee table. Your muscles would scream louder than the battle horns. Training was brutal. You had to keep your formation tight because the famous phalanx depended on every soldier's shield protecting their neighbor. One weak link, and the whole wall of death crumbles. Plus, the armor was rigid. No fancy stretch fabrics or ventilation. If you got hot, sweaty, or scraped, tough luck. And the stink? You'd be lucky if the olive oil didn't just mix with sweat to create a new, ancient Greek eau de toilette that your enemies would easily recognize on the battlefield. Trust me, modern deodorant would be your best friend in that scenario. And if you survived the battle, no promises, you still had to deal with the aftermath, wounds, infections, and the ever-looming threat of diseases. Medicine was a mix of superstition, herbs, and occasionally some actual healing knowledge. But if you thought your ER visits were expensive now, imagine bartering a goat for a poultice and hoping the local doctor didn't accidentally make it worse. Oh, and the politics. I promised you politics would come back, and here we are. Ancient Greek democracy, especially in Athens, was like a full-time job. One that you couldn't clock out of. Citizens were expected to participate in the assembly, which could last for hours or days, debating laws, war decisions, and public policy. So, you'd spend your mornings scraping off olive oil, your afternoons in armor or mush, and your evenings locked in endless debates where everyone shouted louder than a stadium full of sports fans. Voting wasn't a quick click on an app. It was standing, speaking, and sometimes being ostracized. Ostracism! That's a fun one. If you made too many enemies or got too powerful, the citizens could literally vote you into exile for 10 years by scratching your name on a shard of pottery called an ostracon. Imagine the drama. Hey, we like you, but you're just too much. See you in a decade. For a modern person used to cancel culture on Twitter, this was the ultimate IRL banishment. So, your modern self, who's used to quick meals, private bathrooms, comfy clothes, and binge-worthy TV, would be struggling just to stay afloat. The combination of bland, mushy food, questionable hygiene, brutal military gear, and mind-numbing political meetings would have you begging for a single day in your climate-controlled, antibiotic-friendly, Uber-everywhere life. And just when you think you can't take it anymore, the day ends with you sitting on hard stone benches, sweating through your armor, watching a 5-hour play with no intermission and no popcorn. The gods themselves would pity your modern soul. So, next time you complain about your kale smoothie or your office chair, just remember, at least you're not scraping olive oil off your skin with a metal banana, or sharing a sponge stick with a bunch of neighbors while debating whether you should be exiled. But hey, I haven't even gotten to the public toilets yet. End of chunk abruptly. Next up, a sudden detour into the wild adventures of ancient Greek entertainment and the marathon theater experience. All right, buckle up, because now we're diving headfirst into the glorious, gritty, and, let's be honest, kind of horrifying world of ancient Greek hygiene and sanitation. Yes, I know, you probably thought the worst part of ancient Greece was the food or the political shouting matches, but no, my friend, it's the bathrooms. And not just any bathrooms, the public toilets. Picture this. You, a modern person used to your private porcelain throne, your scented candles, your soft toilet paper that feels like a cloud spun from unicorn hair. Now throw all that out the window, because in ancient Athens, your bathroom was a stone bench with holes drilled neatly in a row, perched over a sewer channel. And it was public, like a chatty cafe. Complete strangers, elbow to elbow, dropping what they had to drop while swapping gossip and maybe even debating the latest law about olive oil tariffs. You see, privacy was a luxury the Greeks didn't quite get with their bathrooms. The communal latrine was the ultimate social experience. Imagine walking in, finding your spot, and sitting down next to a guy who just finished telling a story about his neighbor's son who flunked gymnastic training for hoplites. No partitions, no stalls, just a row of holes, and a stream flowing underneath that presumably carried away your business to some place unpleasant enough to be forgotten. Now, you might be thinking, okay, communal toilets, gross, but I can deal if there's at least some hygiene. Nope, there was no soap. At all. The concept of soap as we know it was basically a distant dream. Instead, after your business, you'd grab a spongy stick called a tersorium, a wooden stick with a sea sponge at the end, and rinse yourself in a bucket or a gutter of water that was shared by everyone. Yes, everyone. Imagine the mental image. You and your fellow citizens sharing one communal sponge stick. No gloves, no sanitizers, no antibacterial wipes, just good old-fashioned sponge action. You'd be a walking petri dish by the end of the day. And if you thought you could just bring your own personal sponge? Ha! Good luck explaining that at the public latrine without making everyone else suspicious. In fact, the tersorium was sometimes rinsed in a vinegar or saltwater solution. But that's hardly the spa treatment you're used to at your fancy hotel. Think of it as a communal rinse with a splash of "please don't get me sick." But wait, hygiene wasn't just about toilets. Bathing was a whole different, complicated adventure. Today, you hop into a shower or soak in a tub with scented bubbles while jamming to your favorite playlist. The ancient Greeks, they had public baths, communal again, and they were a big deal. More than just cleaning, bathing was a social event. You'd meet your neighbors, discuss philosophy, sports, or politics, while trying not to think too hard about the guy who showed up with that suspicious rash, and no soap. I repeat, no soap. They used olive oil as their main cleansing agent. You'd slather yourself with olive oil, then scrape it off with a metal tool called a strigil. Sounds fancy, right? But picture this. You're covered head to toe in a sticky layer of oil. Then you have to scrape it off with a curved metal blade, which is effectively like using a butter knife to clean your skin. Not exactly the spa treatment you're used to. It's like trying to get peanut butter off your fingers with a credit card. Now, if you thought that was bad, imagine the mess when you have to do this in public, surrounded by dozens of other oil-slathered, sweat-dripping, strigil-wielding citizens. The bathhouses were hot, steamy, noisy, and not exactly designed for personal space. You'd be elbow to elbow with your exasperated neighbor trying to scrape olive oil and grime off with a metal blade. And there was no such thing as a modern-day showerhead controlling the water temperature. Water had to be carried, heated manually, and shared. So you had a small bucket of lukewarm water, a metal scraper, and a crowd of people waiting their turn. In case you're wondering about hair, forget about your shampoo and conditioner rituals. Greeks used various herbal pastes and sometimes ashes to clean their hair. Imagine rinsing your hair with ashes. Sounds like a bad Halloween party gone wrong, doesn't it? But hey, it was the best they had. Oh, and about your clothes. There was no washing machine, no Tide Pods, no quick throw this in the wash button. Laundry was done by hand, often in the river or communal washing pits, using abrasive materials like fuller's earth, a type of clay, or even urine, which was believed to whiten clothes. Yes, urine. So imagine your precious cotton shirt soaked in, well, pee, then beaten against rocks until it's cleanish. If you're a modern person who's ever tried to hand wash a shirt, you're already grimacing. Now add hundreds of gallons of ancient pee. Welcome to Greek Laundry Day. And if you're thinking, well, maybe the streets were clean at least. Ha! The streets of Athens were not exactly spotless. Garbage was often dumped into the streets or in pits outside the city, and the smell could be brutal. Rats and flies were common companions. So imagine trying to enjoy a stroll or a political rally while dodging piles of refuse, the occasional stray dog, and the ever-present threat of disease-carrying vermin. Let's talk about the water supply, too. Most water came from wells or aqueducts, but it wasn't always clean or safe to drink. You'd be drinking from communal fountains or cisterns, often without any filtering. So, your modern self who's used to bottled water or filtered taps? Prepare for a surprise stomach adventure. Traveler's diarrhea would be a given, and of course, your teeth. There was no Crest or Colgate. Greeks used chewing sticks or abrasive powders made from crushed bones or shells to clean their teeth. Imagine brushing your teeth with the equivalent of a tiny pile of gravel. Your modern mouthwash? Non-existent. Your dentist? Probably a barber surgeon who also did minor amputations. You'd be lucky to keep a tooth in your head, so, all this to say, your modern self, who enjoys a 20-minute shower, a private bathroom, laundry machines, and a minty fresh smile, would be horrified by the day-to-day reality of ancient Greek hygiene. You'd be sticky, smelly, and constantly worried about your health. No wonder philosophers like Socrates spent so much time talking and less time worrying about personal cleanliness. They probably just gave up. Now, here's a fun twist. Despite all this filth, the Greeks were obsessed with physical fitness, beauty, and athleticism. They'd compete in the Olympics, work out in the palestra, and admire the nude male form in statues and art. So yes, you'd be expected to look like a Greek god while sharing sponges with your neighbors and scraping sweat, oil, and dirt off your skin with a metal blade. Talk about dedication. And just when you think you've wrapped your head around the sanitary struggle, remember this. The public toilets were also famously the places where much gossip and political plotting happened. So the stink wasn't the only thing filling the air. There were heated debates, whispered secrets, and maybe even the occasional scandalous revelation. Imagine being in a row of toilet holes, awkwardly trying to do your business, while overhearing a senator's plan to exile one of his rivals. Not exactly the relaxing bathroom break you're used to. So, next time you complain about a slow Wi-Fi connection or a long line at Starbucks, just picture yourself perched on a cold stone bench, sharing a sponge with a stranger, scraping off layers of olive oil and sweat, while trying desperately not to inhale too deeply or get involved in a political conspiracy. And speaking of exhausting daily rituals, doesn't this remind you a bit of that endless democracy meeting we talked about earlier? Because hygiene wasn't the only thing demanding your patience and stamina. But I'll get to that in a moment. Or maybe I won't. Because now, speaking of stamina and pain, let's cut to the battlefield, literally. Imagine strapping on 60 pounds of bronze armor in the scorching sun. But hey, you gotta look good while you're shuffling in a phalanx, right? And we'll get to that. Just not right now. Instead, let's circle back to your dinner plate, where the beloved Puls awaits you, thick, gloopy porridge, a staple of the Greek diet, without a hint of sugar to sweeten your grim existence. But more on that later. For now, just try to imagine the day in and day out. You wake up, scrape the olive oil off your skin, sit on a communal toilet with strangers, share a sponge, wash off with a metal blade in a crowded bathhouse, and still have to present yourself as a civilized citizen ready for heated political debate. Yes, my modern friend, you wouldn't last a day, and honestly, neither would I. All right, let's dive headfirst into the culinary abyss that is ancient Greek cuisine. Imagine you're starving, truly ravenous after a brutal day of, well, whatever it was you were doing. Probably dodging death in the phalanx or enduring the joys of communal toilet time. You stumble into your humble abode, eager to feast like a king, and what do you find? Puls. Yes, Puls. The ancient Greek culinary masterpiece of, let's boil some grains into something so thick and bland that even a modern toddler would reject it. It's basically porridge's middle-aged, world-weary cousin, and it's everywhere. Now, you might be thinking, hey, porridge isn't so bad. I mean, I eat oatmeal sometimes, sure. But this isn't your sugary maple syrup-drenched breakfast bowl. Nope. This is a dense, gloopy, unseasoned mush made from barley or wheat, boiled in water or sometimes watered-down broth. No honey, no sugar, no cinnamon, just grain. It's like the culinary equivalent of being told to drink water for the rest of your life because calories are overrated. And before you ask, yes, the ancient Greeks mostly ate this stuff morning, noon, and night. You might try to jazz up your Puls with some olive oil, maybe a bit of salt, but don't expect a flavor explosion. In fact, the olive oil was more like a necessary evil, a way to add some calories and fat because the Greeks were famously frugal. And since sugar is completely absent, we're talking about an age before the sweet revolution, your taste buds would be perpetually stuck on meh. Imagine sitting down for dinner, if you can call it that, with a bowl of this unappetizing sludge. No fire-grilled steak, no bubbling pots of spicy stew, just a bowl of beige sadness. And if you complain about it, you're considered a bit spoiled because, hey, at least you're eating Puls and not foraging for wild roots or, heaven forbid, eating another handful of olives straight from the brine. And meat? Forget about it. Unless you're an aristocrat or a lucky festival attendee, meat was a rare treat, usually reserved for sacrifices or special occasions. Most people's protein came from legumes, or the occasional fish, which they probably either overcooked to oblivion or salted to the point of resembling leather. Your modern carnivore dreams? Dead on arrival in ancient Greece. Now I hear you asking, what about wine? Surely that makes it better. Ah yes, the famed Greek wine. But hold your horses. Drinking wine was indeed common, but they always diluted it with water. Straight wine was considered barbaric, a little ancient, don't be an idiot policy for the ages. So you'd be sipping on a watery, slightly fermented grape concoction while trying to choke down your Puls. Yum! And while we're on the topic of food, let's not forget the absolute horror show that was ancient Greek food storage. No refrigerators, no airtight containers, No, just pop it in the freezer for later. You had to eat what you could get your hands on quickly, or else it would spoil and attract flies, rats, and probably the occasional disgruntled neighbor looking for a snack. Which brings me to another fun fact. The ancient Greek market, while bustling and lively, was also a bit of a crapshoot. Freshness wasn't guaranteed. You might buy some olives, and who knows, they might be 3 months old. Or that fish you picked up might have seen better days before it became dinner. The whole farm-to-table idea was more like farm to who knows when and where. So, picture this. You wake up, scrape off your olive oil and dirt from yesterday, sit on a communal toilet with 5 strangers, and a shared sponge. Then trudge to the market, where you pick up some questionable produce and maybe a chunk of stale bread. Then you come home to a dinner of Puls, diluted wine, and a side of hope this doesn't kill me. Bon appetit. But hey, if you think that's rough, just wait until you have to navigate ancient Greek politics. Because after all that culinary delight, you're expected to show up at the assembly and debate the fate of the city-state for hours on end. Democracy was great and all, but it came with a time commitment that would make your modern workday look like a coffee break. And speaking of exhausting commitments, imagine you're a hoplite, one of those heavily armored soldiers who hustled around in 60 pounds of bronze gear in the blazing sun while hoping your phalanx doesn't turn into a human pancake. Sounds like a dream, right? No? Yeah, didn't think so. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Remember, you're still trying to digest your pulse, feeling the gritty texture rubbing against your tongue, and contemplating how your ancestors survived without a single Twinkie or a Snickers bar to look forward to. It's almost poetic, really. The food of the ancient Greeks was designed not to delight, but to sustain, to keep you alive long enough to do your civic duty, not because it tasted good. And if you're lucky, you might get a festival or a feast where meat and honey make a rare appearance. But for the everyday person, it's Puls and water wine with a side of grit. Now, if your stomach isn't churning in despair yet, let's talk about cleanup. Because after eating this medieval version of mush, you don't exactly have modern plumbing or soap to wash your hands. You might rinse them in a basin of water, maybe even communal water. Then rub them with some olive oil and scrape it off with a metal blade called a strigil. Yes, your cleaning routine involves scraping oil and dirt off your skin with a curved metal tool. Sounds relaxing, right? And that oil? It wasn't just for cleaning. It was also to protect your skin from the sun and dust, which were abundant. Considering you spend a fair bit of your day outdoors, walking on dusty streets or sitting in stone seats at the theater. Speaking of the theater, you might think that Greek entertainment would be a fabulous break from this grim existence. But no. Imagine sitting in a huge open-air amphitheater, baked by the sun, for hours on end, watching plays that could last all day. No popcorn, no intermission snacks, just you and the distant smell of sweat and goats, and the plays themselves, full of long speeches, philosophical musings, and tragic twists, delivered in a language and style that would make modern sitcoms look like light reading. You'd be squinting, trying to follow the chorus as they sing odes that last longer than your morning commute, all while your stomach growls for something other than pulse. So, to sum up your day, wake up covered in olive oil and dust, sit on a communal toilet with strangers, eat a diet so bland it could be used as a sleep aid, clean yourself with a metal scraper, attend hours-long political debates or plays, and if you're lucky, maybe get to march around in heavy armor while pretending you're tough. You might think, okay, but surely they had some sweet treats? Nope. Sugar was so rare it was basically a myth. Ancient Greeks used honey sparingly, mostly in religious rituals or elite banquets, not as everyday sweeteners. No candy bars, no chocolate, no caffeine fix. Your sweet tooth would be left crying into its pulse. So, if you ever think your modern life is tough because your artisanal latte is cold or your smartphone battery dies, just remember, in ancient Greece, people scraped oil off their skin with metal blades, shared sponges in the bathroom, ate thick porridge all day, and debated politics until their tongues were numb. Would you last a day? Heck no. You'd be begging for Wi-Fi, a hot shower, and maybe a cheeseburger. Because let's face it, ancient Greece was full of wonders, yes, but daily life? It was a relentless, gritty slog where your biggest pleasures involved staying alive long enough to complain about how hard it all was. And speaking of complaints, next time someone mentions ostracism, yeah, that ancient practice of voting to exile citizens for 10 years. Remember, you couldn't just tweet your frustrations. You had to show up in person, convince hundreds of your peers that you were a threat, and then pack your bags for a decade. No appeal, no block this user button. Just exile. Lovely. But hey, before we get tangled up in another political headache, maybe we should circle back. Wait, where were we? Ah yes, the Puls. Because at the end of the day, no matter how many philosophical debates you engage in, or how many battles you survive, you're still gonna have to eat that gloopy porridge. And if you think that sounds like a fate worse than death, congratulations. You're already thinking like a modern person. You wouldn't last a day. Neither would I. Now, picture this. You've just survived the breakfast ordeal, which, let's be honest, probably involved staring down a bowl of Puls. That ancient Greek staple that looks less like food and more like something your neighbor forgot to scrape off their garden pot. You think you're done? Ha! No, my friend, because ancient Greek dining is not a grab-and-go experience. It's a full-contact sport involving olive oil, vinegar, and a confusing amount of bread. Imagine walking into an ancient Greek andron, the men's dining room, which is less comfortable lounge and more strategically arranged reclining couches for maximum elbow bumping. You're handed a piece of bread, not a sandwich, just a dry, crusty chunk of wheat. Now you might be tempted to ask, hey, where's the butter, the jam, the honey? And the answer is, don't be ridiculous. Honey was sacred and scarce, reserved for the gods and the elite, which means your sweet tooth takes a hike. Instead, you dip that bread into some olive oil and vinegar mixture that's supposed to jazz things up. Except, surprise! The olive oil is thick, peppery, and leaves your fingers slicker than a politician at a public debate. So you spend half the meal wiping your hands on your tunic, and the other half wondering why you didn't just bring a granola bar from 2024. And speaking of olive oil, did you know ancient Greeks considered it a kind of all-purpose magic potion? They used it on their skin, their hair, their food, and, here's the kicker, even as soap. Because here's a fun fact. Soap as we know it probably didn't exist. Instead, you'd rub yourself down with olive oil, then scrape it off with a little metal tool called a strigil. Yes, imagine exfoliating with a curved blade every day. Modern spa treatments have nothing on you, apparently. But wait. There's more. Hygiene wasn't exactly a solo luxury. Public baths were the social hubs, and you'd be rubbing shoulders, and everything else, with pretty much everyone else in town. No gender separation, no privacy, just you, your body oil, and the neighbor's questionable armpit hygiene. And don't get me started on the communal sponges in the toilets. Yes, communal. Picture a sea sponge on a stick that everyone shares, rinsed in a bucket of water. You thought your coworker's keyboard was gross? Try sharing a toilet sponge with half the city. Now, you're probably thinking, alright, so food's meh, hygiene's questionable, but at least they had politics, right? Democracy and all that jazz? Yes, but democracy in ancient Athens was like a full-time job with 0 remote options. You wanted to participate? Great. Prepare to clear your schedule for days of endless debates in the ecclesia, the citizen assembly, where speeches went on for hours, and the stakes were your freedom or exile. Remember ostracism? Voting to kick someone out of town for 10 years? Imagine having to convince hundreds of your peers face to face that you're not a threat, all without the convenience of a viral tweet or an Instagram story. Just you, your rhetoric skills, and a crowd ready to exile you into oblivion. And if you survive the political grind, maybe you think you get to relax with some entertainment. Nope. Ancient Greek plays were marathon affairs. These weren't your Netflix binge sessions with comfy couches and popcorn. No, these were full-day events under the blazing sun, featuring tragedies and comedies that often lasted from morning until late afternoon. You'd be sitting there in a stone amphitheater, sweating in your tunic, listening to actors recite dense poetry with masks that probably made it hard to hear and see. The only break? A pause to gulp down more Puls or dry wine diluted with water, because straight-up wine was considered barbaric. And speaking of wine, let's chat about that. Ancient Greek wine was like the original social lubricant, except it was so watered down that modern taste buds might find it more like, I don't know, grape-flavored water. Drinking undiluted wine was for the unrefined or the reckless, which means your idea of a late-night glass of Merlot would seem like a wild party to them. So, you'd be sitting there sipping what's basically grape juice with a splash of alcohol, trying not to pass out in the sun. Now, if you think all this sounds exhausting, hold onto your hoplite helmet, because warfare was no cakewalk either. Those hoplites, the heavily armored infantrymen, wore bronze helmets, breastplates, greaves, and carried shields that weighed as much as a small child. Picture trying to sprint in a 30-pound metal suit on a hot day with sandals that left your feet exposed to every rock and thorn. You'd be sweating buckets, scraping your skin raw under the armor, and all for a battle that might last minutes or stretch for hours with little to no food or water. And when the fighting got intense, your biggest worry wasn't the enemy, but whether your armor was chafing in all the wrong places. So, you've eaten Puls, scrubbed yourself with oil and a blade, debated politics until your tongue and brain were numb, sat through epic plays in the sun, and maybe even marched into battle wearing what amounts to a medieval metal onesie. And after all that, you still have to deal with the constant lack of modern conveniences. No heating, no air conditioning, no instant communication, and definitely no Uber Eats delivery. At this point, you'd probably be begging for the sweet relief of a cold shower, a soft bed, and the ability to order a pizza without having to barter in the marketplace first. You'd be fantasizing about your smartphone, your Netflix queue, and the cushy life of someone who can complain about work from the comfort of their ergonomic chair. But the ancient Greeks? They didn't have that luxury. They had debates that could last all day, communal baths that doubled as social events, diets that would make your taste buds file a formal complaint, and armor that was basically wearable torture. So no, you wouldn't last a day, not even a morning. And if you think you'll catch a break by just avoiding the political arena or skipping the military service, remember, ancient Greek society was so intertwined that every citizen had a role, and shirking your duty wasn't just frowned upon, it could get you ostracized or worse. No freeloaders allowed. So next time you grumble about your slow Wi-Fi or your boss's endless emails, remember the ancient Greek grind. They didn't have coffee shops, gym memberships, or even proper toilets. They had grit, debate marathons, and Puls, that gloopy, unrelenting staple that somehow fueled an entire civilization. And speaking of staples, I almost forgot, before we veer off into the next calamity, there's the matter of the symposium. The ancient drinking party that was supposed to be the pinnacle of entertainment and socializing. But instead of your casual Friday night with friends, imagine sitting around a room filled with tunic-clad philosophers and poets, where the wine flows, diluted of course, and the conversation is less, "Did you see the game?" and more, "Let's debate the nature of the cosmos for 6 hours straight." Yeah, no thanks. You'd be nodding off by hour 2, wishing for a meme or a TikTok to break the monotony. Because the ancient Greeks may have had the birthplace of democracy and philosophy, but they sure knew how to make life an endless, sweaty, sticky slog. And that, dear friend, is why you wouldn't last a day. But hold on, wait a second. Did I mention the communal sponges? Because honestly, those deserve their own chapter. Ah yes, the communal sponges. Because nothing says, "Welcome to ancient Greece," like sharing your butthole cleaning apparatus with your neighbor. Picture this. You're squatting over a stone toilet seat, a throne of pure austerity, with not a roll of Charmin in sight, but instead a sea sponge on a stick. And it's not just your sponge, oh no, it's the communal sponge, bathed in a bucket of water, passed around between the gentlemen of the police like an ancient version of the peace pipe. Now, I know what you're thinking. Surely this can't be true. There has to be some hygiene nuance I'm missing. But no, it's true. The ancient Greeks, in their wisdom, figured soap was either a luxury or just unnecessary fuss. Instead, they relied on water, scraping, and that trusty communal sponge. Which means that your bathroom break is now a group activity, a bonding ritual of sorts, if your idea of bonding is an awkward, stinky handshake with everyone's backside. So, say you're a modern person, cleanliness freak, sanitizer in your purse, wipes in your backpack. How do you cope? You don't. You retreat into a corner, clutching your invisible hand sanitizer, while the sponges do their rounds. And the worst part? This setup was in public latrines, where the only privacy is a half wall or a row of stone seats side by side. No soundproofing, no partitions, just the pleasant symphony of bodily functions and philosophical conversations about, ironically, cleanliness. But wait, we're not done with hygiene horrors just yet. Communal bathing was also a thing. And no, it wasn't your soothing, scented bubble bath with lavender oil. The public bathhouse was the social hub of the ancient Greek world. And everyone, you, your neighbor, the weaver's son, probably even the local goat herder, would be squeezed together in a steaming pool of soapy sweat and questionable hygiene. Imagine trying to relax in a pool while the guy next to you is recounting his latest military exploits, and the woman across is gossiping about the latest political scandal, while you're desperately trying to avoid eye contact and the flotsam floating around you. And yes, there was no soap as we know it. They used olive oil, rubbing it on your skin and then scraping it off with a tool called a strigil. So instead of bubbles and fresh scents, you spent your bath time smearing yourself in oil and scraping off grime with a curved blade. Ah, the spa day of champions. Now, shifting gears completely, because that's how this monologue rolls, let's talk about the daily fuel of the ancient Greek citizen, food. Specifically the constant presence of Puls. If you don't know Puls, imagine a porridge, but one that's been boiled down to a gloopy, flavorless mush. Think oatmeal, but less inviting and with all the personality of wet cardboard. This was the bread and butter, or rather, the bread and gruel of the Greek diet. It was made from barley or wheat, sometimes legumes, always served with very little seasoning because spices were a luxury. You, with your avocado toast and artisan coffee, would stare blankly at a bowl of Puls and wonder if it's a prank. But no, this was your breakfast, lunch, and dinner if you were a common citizen. And forget about sugar. The ancient Greeks had honey, yes, but refined sugar was as alien as a smartphone in a Spartan barracks. Your sweet tooth? Starving. You might get figs or olives to snack on, but the diet was predominantly savory, salty, and spare. Now, imagine going through your day, debating politics, fighting wars, or attending endless plays, more on those later, all fueled by this unvarnished porridge. No caffeine, no energy drinks, no candy bars, just Puls and maybe a chunk of cheese if you were lucky. And the thirst? Wine was the go-to, but it was diluted with water and drunk more as a social lubricant than a sugar rush. You'd be running on fumes trying to maintain your philosophical composure while your stomach begs for mercy. Speaking of plays, because it's time to shuffle our mental playlist to entertainment. You think you got the attention span for a 2-hour movie? Forget it. Greek plays were marathon affairs. They could last all day. Tragedies, comedies, satyr plays, each performed back-to-back during festivals like the Dionysia. Picture sitting in an outdoor theater, under the glaring sun or under a drizzle of olive oil sweat from your fellow theater-goers, watching actors wear enormous masks and declaiming poetry in an ancient dialect. The only concession to comfort was a slab of stone to sit on. No popcorn, no restroom breaks, no buffering, and the themes? Heavy stuff. Death, destiny, the wrath of gods, existential dread. Entertaining, right? You'd be longing for a meme or a BuzzFeed quiz to break the monotony. Even the comedy had layers of political satire that flew over most modern heads without a PhD in ancient Greek culture. So your idea of Netflix and chill would be Aeschylus and agony. And if you made it through the day without collapsing from hunger, boredom, or hygiene trauma, you'd still have to face the political landscape. Democracy, they say, was born here, but it was a full-time job. Citizens were expected to attend assemblies, debate, vote, and sometimes be ostracized, banished for 10 years, if you got on the wrong side of the political majority. So you couldn't just clock out and binge-watch your favorite shows. Your social life was government meetings and endless rhetoric. No pressure, right? Democracy was less of a weekend hobby and more of an all-consuming identity. Plus, if you were one of the unlucky few called to military service, you'd be lugging around hoplite armor that weighed about 60 pounds. Let me tell you, that bronze chestplate didn't breathe, and the helmet wasn't exactly a breeze. You'd be sweating buckets before the first spear was even thrown. Forget about sprinting after your Uber. You'd barely manage a quick walk to the battlefield without needing a nap, so between the diet of gritty Puls, the swampy communal baths, The ancient version of social media that was politics. Marathon plays that could outlast your will to live. And armor that doubled as a medieval bodyweight workout. The ancient Greeks sure knew how to keep you on your toes, or flat on your face. And if this all sounds exhausting, congratulations, you're already more prepared than most. Modern folks who'd last approximately 20 minutes before calling their mom for a ride home. But as we pivot back because we're clearly allergic to neat transitions, let's talk about one last thing before I leave you gasping for breath like a hoplite. After a forced march, the nature of voting in the Athenian democracy. You might imagine a quick ballot, a few taps on your phone, and voila, your voice is heard. Nope. Voting was a theatrical production in itself. Citizens would gather in the Nix, the massive hill where the assembly met, and participate in shouting matches, speeches, and yes, sometimes voting by show of hands or dropping pebbles in urns. But the process was slow, deliberate, and you had to be there in person. No absentee ballots, no mail-in votes, no proxy. If you were sick, too bad. Democracy didn't send you a Zoom link, and the stakes were high. If you didn't show up, you risked penalties. And if your speech was unpopular, you might find yourself ostracized, literally exiled from the city for a decade, as a way to cool off the political heat. Imagine that. One day you're arguing passionately about grain tariffs. The next, you're packing your sandals for a 10-year forced vacation. Talk about a political timeout. So next time you grumble about filling out a census form or waiting in line to vote, remember, ancient Greek democracy was less one person. One vote and more, one person all day, no breaks, and don't even think about complaining. And now, before I let you collapse under the sheer weight of ancient reality, remember the communal sponge? Yeah, I didn't just mention it in passing. It's a symbol of the whole experience. Messy, shared, utterly uncomfortable, but somehow all part of the grand experiment that was ancient Greece. So, would you last a day? Maybe. But only if you came equipped with a strong stomach, a sense of humor, and an endless supply of wet wipes from the future. Otherwise, you'd be the first person booked for ostracism, or worse, sent home with a sponge on a stick and a polite, good luck. And that's just a day in the life. But before we jump back into the political thunderdome or the hoplites' grueling shuffle, let me drag you, kicking and groaning, into the kitchen of an ancient Greek household. Yes, the kitchen, where the smells might make you swoon, or more likely, make you question every single choice you've ever made about food. Now, picture yourself waking up in Athens. The sun casting its golden light over white marble columns, birds chirping, the distant sound of sandals slapping on stone streets. You're hungry, naturally, but don't expect a breakfast buffet with avocado toast, artisanal coffee, or a frothy latte. Nope. Your morning meal is going to be mostly Puls. That's right, Puls, the ancient Greek equivalent of porridge, but infinitely less glamorous. Imagine a bowl of thick, soupy gruel made from barley or wheat, boiled into a paste, sometimes with a splash of olive oil or a sprinkle of salt if you're lucky. It's the breakfast of champions, or at least the breakfast of people who weren't spoiled by the invention of sugar or honey on tap. Now, sugar was basically a myth to these folks. Honey was the closest thing to sweet, and even then it was a precious commodity, more likely to be dabbed sparingly on a cake or mixed into wine than dumped like maple syrup on pancakes. So, you take your first spoonful of Puls and, well, it doesn't taste like much. Is it bland, you ask? Yes, bland is a compliment in this context. Your palate is about to be trained to treat sweetness like a mythic beast, something you might hear about from travelers but never actually meet. Lunch? Don't expect a sandwich or a salad bar. It's more bread, olives, maybe some cheese if your wallet allows. And if you're really fancy, a few dried figs. Meat? Ha! That's the luxury of the wealthy or the special occasion. For most, meat was a rarity, more of a festival treat than a daily staple. Fish was more common, especially near coastal cities, but even that was often salted or dried to last. Now, here's where it gets truly wild for the modern you. They ate with their hands. No forks, no knives at the table. Well, knives, yes, but only for preparation. Eating was mostly finger food, and no napkins. You had to be comfortable wiping your hands on your clothes or a communal cloth, because paper towels were centuries away from being a thing. And speaking of cleanliness, get ready for a culture shock. Soap wasn't soap as you know it. They used olive oil to clean their bodies, rubbing it on and then scraping it off with a tool called a strigil. Picture this. After a day of sweating in the sun and wrestling with a hoplite shield, you'd slather yourself with olive oil, then use a curved metal scraper to scrape off the grime, oil, and dead skin. It's like exfoliation but with a side of medieval torture. Now, imagine trying to do that in the morning rush before you have to schlep down to the agora or the assembly. No quick shower, no shampoo, just you, oil, and a metal blade. If that doesn't terrify you, maybe the communal public toilets will? Yes, public toilets. Imagine a row of stone benches with holes, side by side. No privacy screens. Just a bunch of citizens sitting shoulder to shoulder conducting their business with zero shame. Think of it as the original water cooler chat spot. Except the talk is a little less PG. No toilet paper either. Just a sponge on a stick shared among all users. You really want to lose a few friends? Try borrowing the sponge without adequately rinsing it. But back to food, because this is where it gets deliciously perplexing. The ancient Greeks loved their bread, but not the fluffy, yeasty wonder you get today. Their bread was dense, made from barley or wheat, sometimes with bits of herbs or sesame seeds for flavor. And it was their main energy source. Forget about grabbing a protein bar or a smoothie. Your fuel came from this dense, gritty fuel source, which you'd eat with a hearty drizzle of olive oil, a handful of olives, or some cheese. Oh, cheese. They had cheese, but it was salty and crumbly. Think of something between feta and the kind of cheese you'd find drying out in your fridge if you forgot about it for a couple of weeks. Not exactly your creamy brie dreams and sweets. Honey was the star, often diluted in wine to create a kind of ancient mead. But it was rare and costly enough that you couldn't just pour it over your cereal. You'd celebrate special occasions with honey cakes that were dense and sticky, not like the pastries you're used to. Did they have vegetables? Sure, but nothing like the kale and quinoa salads you Instagram. Think cucumbers, onions, garlic, and plenty of legumes like lentils and chickpeas. These were the protein replacements for the regular person. Hearty and filling, but not exactly Instagrammable. So, you're sitting there, maybe trying to choke down your barley gruel, your fingers sticky from olive oil, your breath smelling faintly of garlic, and you realize you're about to spend the day doing, well, a lot of standing, walking, talking, and sometimes fighting, without a single Snickers bar in sight. Now, consider what happens when you hit the gym, or, should I say, the palestra. No fancy protein shakes here. Instead, you'd train and then head to the baths, where, yes, communal bathing was the norm. The baths were social hubs, a place to chat, relax, and clean off the day's grime. But remember, no soap, just water, oil, and scraping. And the baths were segregated by gender, because even in communal nakedness, there were limits to what ancient Greeks deemed appropriate. Men might lounge nude, chatting philosophy or politics, while women had their own time and space. You, the modern person used to private showers and bath bombs, would find yourself blushing and desperately trying to cover your bits with a small towel that everyone else seems to have abandoned. And let's just pause on the idea of personal hygiene for a moment. No deodorant, no toothpaste, no mouthwash. The ancient Greeks chewed on mint leaves or used crushed herbs to freshen breath. But that morning, coffee breath. It was likely the same back then, minus the coffee, but plus a lot more garlic and onions. So, you might ask, how did these people survive socially with such a pungent environment? Well, they were used to it. Your eau d'ancien Greece would eventually become your signature scent, and besides, the olive oil scraping ritual was more about removing dirt and sweat than actually smelling like roses. Oh, and here's a fun fact. Wine was their go-to drink, but it was always diluted. Straight wine was considered barbaric, so Greeks mixed it with water. Sometimes a lot of water. So if you're imagining a wild toga party, spoiler alert. It was more like a sophisticated wine punch soiree, with everyone trying to avoid getting too drunk and embarrassing themselves in front of Socrates. But back to food for a moment, because I can't resist. Let's talk about the absence of sugar again. Imagine you're used to cinnamon rolls and chocolate chip cookies, then suddenly handed a slice of dry bread with a smear of goat cheese and a drizzle of bitter olive oil. Your sweet tooth would be in revolt. And speaking of revolt, the diet was so monotonous that it's a wonder anyone had the energy to debate philosophy or fight wars. But they did, because, well, hunger builds character, or maybe it just forces you to focus on bigger existential questions, like, how many olives can one person eat before they turn green? Now, don't think the poor ancient Greek diet was without its perks. The emphasis on fresh, local ingredients meant there were no suspiciously fluorescent packaged snacks. Every bite you took came from something with a name and a face. Or at least, a plant with roots in the earth. You might survive a day eating this way, but only if you had the patience of a saint, the stomach of a camel, and an iron will to ignore every Instagram food post you'd ever seen. Before you start dreaming of the modern supermarket aisle, take a moment to remember this. The ancient Greeks didn't just eat their food, they lived their food. Meals were social, political, and sometimes religious events. Skipping the symposium meant missing out on lively debates that could last hours, fueled by endless cups of watered-down wine and a plate of breadcrumbs and olives. Speaking of symposia, imagine sitting there, surrounded by fellow citizens, drinking slowly, discussing everything from the nature of the cosmos to the best way to prepare Puls, and you trying not to choke, while your stomach growls louder than the heated, philosophical argument. And on that note, because food is just one ingredient in this ancient recipe, let's pivot abruptly, as promised, to the battlefield, where the hoplite is struggling not just with hunger, but with 40 pounds of bronze armor strapped to their body, and the certainty that they'll be standing in formation for hours, possibly getting a spear shoved into their chest. But that, dear modern friend, is a story for another chaotic, out-of-sequence chapter. For now, chew on this. Without sugar, without forks, and with a communal sponge as your closest bathroom companion, the daily grind of ancient Greece was a wild ride. One you'd probably bail on before lunch. So would you last a day? If you can survive the Puls, the communal baths, and the sponge-on-a-stick toilet, congratulations. You're already ahead of most. But don't get cocky. The day isn't over yet, and the ancient Greeks had plenty more tricks to test your endurance. And with that tantalizing cliffhanger, let me leave you pondering your next meal, maybe with a latte in hand, and thank the gods you're not scraping olive oil off your skin this morning. Ah, so you thought you could just saunter through the streets of Athens, grab a gyro, check your Instagram, and bask in the glory of democracy, right? Spoiler alert, democracy in ancient Greece wasn't exactly the click, like, and move on affair you're used to. No, sir, you'd better be ready to commit. And when I say commit, I mean full on, 100%, can't hide behind your phone commitment. Picture this. It's the morning of a big assembly day. The ecclesia, where male citizens gather to debate and vote on everything from war declarations to public funding for, say, a new temple or the latest tragic play. You, the modern you, who's still trying to figure out where to swipe right, are expected to be there, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, ready to spend not 20 minutes, but all day. Yes, all day. Discussing politics. There's no "I have a Zoom call" excuse. No, sorry, I'm binge-watching Netflix defense. Nope, it's you. The hot Athenian sun, the marble steps, and what feels like an eternity of speeches from men in togas who apparently missed the memo that brevity is the soul of wit. Now you might think, I'm a busy person. I can't just hang out all day listening to debates. Well, tough luck. If you wanted to have a say, if you wanted your voice to count, you had to be present. And not just present, but active. Because if you didn't show up, ostracism. That's right, a literal exile from the city for 10 years. And no, you can't just complain about cancel culture on Twitter and make it go away. The ancient Greeks took this seriously. Imagine, you wake up, probably still half asleep, stumble out of your clay-strewn house, and trudge your way to the Pnyx Hill where the assembly meets. It's hot, crowded, and noisy, and all you want is to grab a coffee and scroll your phone. But hey, phones don't exist. So you sit, listening to a marathon of speeches that feel like they're lasting longer than the last season of your favorite TV show. And you don't even get a snack break. You start craving something sweet. Oh wait, sugar doesn't exist here. You're stuck with wine diluted with water and maybe some olives if you're lucky. And when your turn comes to speak, because every citizen has the right to, it's terrifying. You're expected to stand up, project your voice, and make a persuasive argument without the aid of PowerPoint slides or bullet points. You try to channel your inner Socrates, but instead you sound like you're reciting a grocery list. The crowd starts to fidget. The sun is beating down. Your toga is uncomfortable. You're sweating, your mouth is dry, and all you can think of is the communal bath you'll have to endure later. Speaking of which, communal baths. Oh yes, because after spending hours debating politics, what better way to relax than to dip into a public bath with a bunch of your fellow citizens, where modesty is more of a suggestion than a rule. Imagine your modern sensibilities clashing with that. You, the person who needs at least 3 pumps of hand sanitizer before touching a doorknob, naked in a steamy room full of strangers who are chatting, wrestling, and maybe even discussing that very assembly you just left. And soap? Ha! The Greeks didn't have soap like you do. They used olive oil and a scraping tool called a strigil to clean off dirt and sweat. You'd be rubbing oil all over yourself, then scraping it off, which sounds like a lot of work, and not particularly refreshing. Plus, sharing oil in a public bath? No thanks. I'll take my scented body wash and private shower any day. But back to politics, because it's not just the assembly. If you manage to survive the day, you still have jury duty. Yes, the Athenians had massive juries, sometimes thousands of citizens, sitting for hours, hearing cases, arguing, and voting. So after your assembly marathon, you might have to spend the afternoon in a courtroom, listening to legal arguments that make your last Zoom meeting look like a TikTok video. And all this civic duty? No paid leave, no work from home. You either take a day off your job or lose income, which makes you wonder how they manage to keep the economy running when everyone's supposed to be out spending their days in political debates and jury duty. Spoiler, many didn't, which is why you had a bunch of poor citizens with little time to work, living hand to mouth. Now, imagine you're a hoplite, the heavily armored infantryman. This is where things get real physical. You're strapped into bronze armor that weighs about 40 pounds, roughly the same as carrying a small dog or a large bowling ball, wrapped in a heavy wool cloak, carrying a spear, a shield that's basically a rolling door, and a short sword. Summer's blazing, and you have to march for miles, stand in formation for hours, and then fight. You sweat buckets. Your armor chafes and pinches. You're thirsty, hungry, and sore, and for energy, well, you're munching on Puls, that thick, mushy porridge made of barley or wheat. No sugar, no chocolate chip energy bars, just grain sludge with maybe some olive oil or herbs for flavor. It's like if your oatmeal had a bad day and decided to wear a burlap sack. And forget about protein shakes. Your protein comes from occasional fish or cheese if you're lucky. But wait, you're also expected to be part of the symposium, the Ancient Greek drinking party / philosophical think tank. After a grueling day of politics or battle, you might want to kick back with some wine. But remember, the wine is watered down, because Greeks thought undiluted wine was barbaric, and conversations can last hours. They debated everything, ethics, metaphysics, the meaning of life, until you feel your brain melting from the heat and the headache from the wine. And entertainment? No Netflix, no Instagram reels. The Greeks had theater, long plays that could last all day, with intervals for eating and chatting. Imagine sitting through a tragedy or comedy that runs for 6 hours, with no bathroom breaks or popcorn. Plus, the actors wore masks and stomped around a lot, which could be kind of unsettling when you're already tired and hungry. Then, there's the whole hygiene and sanitation issue. Public toilets were a thing, but they were communal. Imagine sitting side by side with strangers on a stone bench, no dividers, using a shared sponge on a stick to wipe. Yes, a sponge, shared, among everyone. And no soap. You might think you're tough, but facing this after a day of politics, battle, and symposium, you'd probably just curl up in a ball and cry. And the smell. With no deodorant, and people sweating under heavy cloaks and armor, the Athenian streets were likely a fragrant mix of olive oil, sweat, and something vaguely like a gym locker room that forgot to clean for a month. So, would you last a day? Maybe, if you can survive the endless debates, the armor that feels like a medieval torture device, the weird mushy food, the communal baths that test your boundaries, and the shared sponges of doom. But hey, at least you'd have great stories to tell. Oh, you think your day was rough? I once spent 12 hours debating democracy, fought in bronze armor, and then used a communal sponge on a stick. How about you? And just as you think you're ready to collapse into your soft bed, dreaming of air conditioning and a fridge full of snacks, remember. The ancient Greeks believed that enduring hardship was part of a good life. They might have had their flaws, like no sugar, no privacy, and an obsession with hours-long theater. But they also laid the foundations for philosophy, democracy, and, well, complaining about how hard life was. So, embrace your modern conveniences, your coffee breaks, your private bathrooms, and your quick Netflix binges. Because the ancient Greek daily grind, that's a marathon without a finish line, and you're stuck in the middle of it wearing bronze armor and debating the meaning of justice, while trying not to get stabbed. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm off to find a place that serves something sweeter than Puls. Maybe a nice caramel latte with extra whipped cream, because surviving ancient Greece, even for a day, is no joke. So, you think you're hungry? Ha! Welcome to the ancient Greek diet, where your idea of a snack is a bowl of Puls. Yes, that glorified porridge that looks like it was made by a bored philosopher who gave up on flavor halfway through. Imagine waking up, rubbing the sleep out of your eyes, and being handed this grayish, mushy concoction made from boiled grains and water, maybe with a splash of olive oil if you're lucky. No sugar, no chocolate, no peanut butter, just Puls all day, every day. You might be thinking, well, how bad can it be? Porridge is decent, right? Wrong. This isn't your grandma's oatmeal with brown sugar and cinnamon. This is a gritty bowl of survival fuel. The staple for farmers, soldiers, and yes, even your favorite toga-wearing philosophers. Because apparently, thinking deep thoughts on an empty stomach was the secret ingredient to ancient Greek wisdom. I mean, Socrates probably discovered the meaning of life right after choking down a spoonful of Puls and wondering why someone hadn't invented sugar yet. And don't even get me started on the lack of meat. If you think a vegan diet is hard, try ancient Greece, where meat was a luxury, mostly reserved for festival days or sacrifices. Not every day. The average Greek peasant's diet was largely plant-based. Olives, figs, beans, and more Puls. Protein came from fish if you lived near the sea, but that was still a treat. You'd quickly get used to meals that looked like they were designed to test your willpower, not satisfy your taste buds. Now, why no sugar? Because sugar as we know it wasn't really a thing in ancient Greece. Honey was the sweetener of choice, but it was precious and used sparingly. So the idea of a candy bar or a cupcake was as alien to them as a smartphone is to a Spartan warrior. Imagine a world where the only sweetness in your life comes from a tiny drizzle of honey on some bitter bread, or fruit so tart it makes your face pucker. That's ancient Greek dessert, if you're lucky. And speaking of lucky, let's talk about wine. Yes, they drank wine, but it was usually watered down, like some kind of ancient sangria with fewer fruit juices. Drinking straight wine was considered uncivilized, probably because it would knock you on your bronze helmet faster than a hoplite charge. So, your happy hour consists of diluted red wine, served in public symposia where you're expected to debate philosophy for hours without passing out. Sounds like a recipe for disaster, or at least a very long hangover. But hey, at least their food wasn't fast food, right? Nope. You're not going to grab a gyro on the go or swing by the agora for a quick snack. Meals were deliberate, slow affairs, often eaten while reclining on couches, surrounded by friends or philosophers, discussing everything from politics to the best method to scoop up Puls without it slipping off your bread. Spoiler, there wasn't a good method, and the texture. If you're someone who likes their food with a bit of crunch or variety, tough luck. Ancient Greek meals were largely soft, mushy, or chewy. They didn't have the luxury of frying things in oil or seasoning with exotic spices. Their cooking was simple: boil, roast, or grill. So expect your taste buds to be as bored as your Instagram feed after a day in Athens. Now, juxtapose this with modern life. You, sitting comfortably in your air-conditioned home, scrolling through food delivery apps, the smell of fresh coffee wafting in the air, and a fridge stocked with kale, avocados, and God forbid, a pint of Ben & Jerry's. You think you could handle a day eating pulls and olives? Washed down with watered-down wine, while wearing a cloak that smells like a goat and debating the merits of democracy? Spoiler, no, you wouldn't last a day. But wait, there's more. Because eating in ancient Greece isn't just about the food, it's about the how and where. Imagine trying to enjoy your meal while mosquitoes are swarming, flies buzzing over your food, and the nearest kitchen is a smoky hearth outside. Hygiene standards being what they were, you might find yourself swatting away insects more than chewing. And washing your hands? Good luck. No soap, no running water, just a communal bowl that's been passed around since the last symposium. Oh, and if you thought modern food packaging was wasteful, consider this. Ancient Greeks carried their food in woven baskets or clay jars. No Tupperware, no plastic wrap. So, if you dropped your Puls, it was gone forever, and probably a bug's new home. Food safety was a gamble, like playing roulette with salmonella. They had no refrigerators, no preservatives, just the hope that your olives didn't ferment into something deadly. And while we're on this gastronomic journey, let's touch on dining customs. Eating was a social event, but not the relaxed, casual affair you might imagine. Meals often involved a strict order. A starter of bread dipped in olive oil, the main Puls course, and maybe some fruit or nuts to finish. Eating quickly or greedily was frowned upon, so you had to pace yourself, which, given the quality of the food, was probably a mercy. Plus, there was the issue of seating. Wealthier Greeks reclined on couches, while poorer citizens sat on simple stools, or even on the ground. So as a modern person used to ergonomic chairs and cushy sofas, you're suddenly grappling with wooden benches or hard stones, trying not to get splinters while you gnaw on your tasteless meal. And in case you thought it couldn't get worse, let's not forget that meals often ended with a philosophical debate or a recitation of poetry. So not only is your stomach grumbling from mediocre food, but your brain is being exercised in ways that might actually increase your hunger. You'll leave the table thinking about the meaning of life, while your stomach growls louder than a Spartan at a wine festival. Now, bringing it all together, let's consider what this means for you, the modern visitor. You arrive in Athens, expecting to soak in history, but quickly realizing that your stomach, your nose, and your patience are all under assault. The food is bland, the portions are small, and the flies are relentless. You try to keep up with the symposium discussions, but all you can think about is the honey-laden latte you left behind. You miss your takeout, your snacks, your sweet treats, and your ability to wash your hands with fancy soap that smells like a tropical forest. So, would you last a day? Maybe, if you have the constitution of a Spartan and the patience of a philosopher. But more likely, you'd be found by the agora, clutching your stomach, begging for a cheeseburger and some hand sanitizer. Because surviving ancient Greek cuisine isn't just about eating. It's about embracing a lifestyle that challenges your senses, your stamina, and your sanity. And yet, here's the irony. Despite all these culinary hardships, the ancient Greeks laid the groundwork for so much of what we cherish today. Their food culture, simple though it was, connected people, sparked debates, and nourished minds and bodies alike. So next time you complain about your kale smoothie or a meal without gluten-free options, just remember the humble Puls and the warriors who ate it while charging into battle. Speaking of battle, now you're probably wondering how those same soldiers kept going on such a diet. Well, Puls was their fuel, simple yet effective. And when they weren't eating mush, they were battling in armor so heavy it would make your gym session look like a warm-up. But that's a story for another time. Because right now, I'm still recovering from the taste of Puls just thinking about it. Anyway, I better wrap this up before you get too hungry, or too disgusted, and start dreaming of modern junk food. Remember, ancient Greek food was no picnic, but it was the foundation of a culture that shaped the Western world. And maybe, just maybe, after a day of Puls and philosophy, you'd develop a newfound appreciation for your coffee, your candy bars, and your indoor plumbing. So, next time you're biting into a juicy burger or savoring a chocolate chip cookie, give a little nod to the Greeks and their relentless, mushy, fly-infested diet, because they survived it, and so can you. Probably. But if you want to last more than a day, pack some honey, maybe a bar of soap, and definitely a good sense of humor. And hey, if you ever find yourself back in ancient Greece, just remember, don't trust the Puls. It looks innocent, but it's plotting your downfall. Now, who's up for a quick dip in the bathhouse? Just kidding. Or am I?